all our different sensory organs, through our ears, nose, mouth, eyes, through the joints in our body, through our skin, etc. When we get the sensory input, this needs to be processed within our brain. And once it's processed, then we can give an appropriate output or a response. Our development and experience of sensory input begins in the womb. Our brain receives, processes the sensory input so that we can interact with our environment to do the everyday things with adequate sensory motor ability and adapt to our emotional and social responses. But if our brain does a poor job of integrating sensations, then we will have to use more effort and difficulty will be experienced with less success and satisfaction. And this often results in a learning difficulty, behavioral difficulties, and anxiety. And sensory processing difficulties or disorders may result when sensory inputs from our environment do not get organized in an appropriate response. Jean Ayres, who was the pioneering occupational therapist and neuroscientist, likened a sensory processing disorder to a neurological traffic jam that prevents certain parts of the brain from receiving the information needing to interpret and process sensory information correctly, and then we cannot act upon the sensory input correctly. This then poses challenges for performing everyday activities. When our brain takes in sensory input and regulate the sensory input, we need to regulate it, and it's like a volume switch, and it creates modulation where the brain takes in all the different input from our senses and sorts it out using our reticular activation system. And then we're able to see what is relevant, what is irrelevant, and then this can send this information on different pathways from our brain to our body parts so that we can adapt and respond functionally to the environmental demands with good self-regulation. But when a child has poor sensory modulation, it results in the child becoming over or under-responsive to the sensory input. They may become sensory seeking, and often anxiety is common in the children who are oversensitive to the sensory input that they get from their environment. These children can experience sensory overload and may dread and avoid situations that they may perceive as very stressful. They can become very worried or anxious in anticipation of finding themselves in a situation that seems like an assault on their sensory level. If you imagine going to the supermarket and seeing a child having a complete sensory meltdown with the parent because there's just too much going on in the shopping mall. And when the mom wants to take them to the shops, they don't want to go because they associate that negative experience of just having so much sensory overload when they went the last time to the shops. So the children who aren't able to accurately discriminate sensory input, it often affects their motor planning. And we're going to discuss this a little bit later and see how that also affects their function on their gross motor skills, fine motor skills, and on a visual and auditory perceptual level. So then we see this is when anxiety results. When a child is having difficulty processing all the sensory input, especially when they find themselves in a very sensory unfriendly environment. And the environment is so important for learning, as Piaget recognized that a child's interaction with his or her environment is really critical for development. So the child with sensory integration difficulty cannot adapt easily to his environment, as he hasn't developed the processing for integrating the sensations from his environment correctly, and this results in him experiencing anxiety. Anxiety created from a sensory processing disorder presents itself very similar to a non-sensory processing disorder when a child has generalized anxiety. Children with a sensory processing disorder will have an emotional response to all the unwanted symptoms, and they can become incredibly frustrated and anxious, doing seemingly normal everyday things like the rest of us.